to do with this again is to provide clarification in case, those that are opponents are charitable and decide to watch this, which I do hope, and I watch their stuff. I think it's okay to engage. Additionally, it's okay for voices of dissent. I think the issue where we're missing each other, and the issue I have is the mischaracterization of the Woke Church Conference, conscious Christianity, and those that would affirm that. When we talk about Woke Church and just even the terminology, the goal is actually rooted in Scripture, rooted in a heart for the gospel. I did a post a couple days ago about the questions I've been receiving as it relates to Woke Church, again, conscious Christianity, and I kind of laid out some aspects of that. I'm gonna go through that, but to start off, the idea of woke is a term that is commonly has been used by the conscious community. If you're unfamiliar with the conscious community, it's primarily urban youth between the ages of 20 all the way up into the 50s that are pro social engagement. It also has a spiritual element that is not rooted in biblical Christianity. And so the heart of this, of us engaging in this idea of Christian wokeness, is to engage a section of people that have primarily been overlooked by our current apologetic systems and structures. And so our current apologetic system and structures tend to focus on people like Bart Ehrman. It tends to focus sometimes on Islam, but not necessarily other mystery cults that are engaging and impacting urban communities. Now, with that said, our goal is not strictly only the urban communities, but all people, because the gospel is a message for all people. And so first thing I did when I did my post is to kind of lay out some aspects of Christian wokeness. And again, in terms of us using this term, this does have a biblical precedent. If you read Acts chapter 17, I think it's verse 28, Paul says, it's in him we live and move and have our being. Then he says, as some of your poets have said. So what Paul does there in the Areopagus is he takes a quote that was not intended for Lord Yeshua and says, this is who this really applies to. And so for us to take the term woke and to say, okay, you think you're woke by fighting for gay rights or fighting for women's rights, and you're fighting for these rights apart from a spiritual awakening. And so what Paul is saying, no, what in the text, it really applies to the God of all creation. And so just to lay out what our position is, the first aspect of Christian wokeness is that it is spiritual. And so I'm going to read Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. It says, for anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And the reason I want to do that one is because that's obviously preceded by Ephesians chapter 2, where he says it's by grace through faith that you have been saved, not by works, that no man can boast. And so this idea of Christian wokeness, it starts with first your awakening to your sin, your own depravity, and your need of salvation. And so we start there. And so anyone saying something different has not asked those that have actually the founders of the movement of the woke church movement and conscious Christianity. We start first with the need of salvation, because if you're engaged in injustice apart from justification, then your justice is futile. So for us, we're saying, in light of us being justified by grace through faith and that alone, we want to engage in the social ills, because the social ills tantamount to sin. And so we're supposed to confess our sins to one another as believers, but then we're also supposed to let the world know about sin and the fact that Christ died for it. So for the conscious Christian or woke Christian, we're saying that wokeness starts with being awakened to your sin and your need of salvation. And so anyone saying anything different is missing the fact that this whole movement is rooted in justification by grace through faith and that alone. That's what we stand on. And so we're saying, in light of being saved, we want to engage in this. So that's the first one. So Christian wokeness is spiritual. Number two is personal. The next verse in Ephesians 5, it says, look carefully then how you walk, not as wise as unwise. We don't negate personal responsibility, as some has wrongly assigned to us. We are not given this blanket statement to say that all people are wrong as a result of things that have happened in the past. What we are saying is that just because certain laws were changed in the 60s, 1968, that the heart can't be legislated. And as a result of that, we all need to be aware of how prejudice and xenophobia can be in us, among other things, not just restricted to the sin of racism and sexism and other isms. All right. So when we say it's personal, we're saying that there's a sanctification aspect that I'm going to talk about later, that we believe that it plays out not just in your dying to sin, but then also how you engage your neighbor. And so there's a personal aspect to Christian wokeness that, again, first starts with your justification by grace through faith, not by works, not by anything you do, but by the finished work of Christ. Colossians 2:14, he has nailed all of our sin to the cross. So it's not what we do, it's what he has done. Thirdly, Christian wokeness is relational. Matthew 25, he says that when you visit the prisoner, you engage the poor, and when you don't do these things, he said that you ignored me. Now, these are Jesus's own words. And so when Jesus says this, he's saying that there's a responsibility for his believers to engage others with his love, and for us to be a tangible display of the gospel that we say we believe and affirm. So in light of that reality, we want to do the same thing. So we want to lovingly engage, and we want to engage in these discussions and take on these conversations and these issues, prayerfully with love. And like any movement, like Reform, the Protestant Reformation, that many would affirm, it wasn't perfect, nor were the Reformers. The Civil Rights Movement, not everyone engaged. We love Dr. King. I'm fully aware that he wasn't a perfect man. The only perfect man with a perfect message was Christ. All of our other heroes are flawed, and we recognize that. And we're not saying that we should ignore their flaws either. And so when we talk about that, there's a relational aspect of it again. So it's spiritual, personal, it's relational in how we engage in these things that we see in our country. Fourthly, it's social. So I read Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Now, some may want to disagree with the hermeneutic and try to say that it doesn't apply. I would just go to Acts chapter 6, and when widows were being overlooked. And so the deacons are formed because I don't think that while this is a major prophet, Isaiah, that the idea of seeking justice, correcting oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's case, that somehow that stopped. This is not something you would apply a cessationist hermeneutic to, as it applies to people in need. And so as a result, yes, we think that social issues need to be confronted, that they should be engaged, and that they should not be ignored. And so we want to talk about these things. Now, typically the argument is that you talk about this, but you ignore abortion. And I'm going to get to that in a second. I'll just say this quickly, that you can be both, that I can be pro-life and anti-police brutality. And that those that are in this movement would affirm that we agree with the sanctity of life. And because Black Lives Matter, of course they have to matter in the womb. But if you only care about me in the womb, but you don't care about my life out of the womb, you're not pro-life, you're simply pro-birth. And we're saying a biblical hermeneutic cares about life from the womb to the tomb. And so if people are disproportionately affected by certain issues, then we should care about that, even if you feel the numbers are low. I remember Candace Owens, a political pundit, before tons of people saying only 16 unarmed black men were killed in 2016. I have an issue with the word only, because I would argue that if it was just one in an entire year, that anyone that's saved by grace through faith should not say, based on the low frequency of an injustice or sin, that we should ignore it. It is not based on the number of people affected. It's about the act of injustice itself. And people who are called by God and redeemed by grace through faith should care about all lives and all injustice with a biblical hermeneutic. And so that's the thing. We are pro-dignity. I see you, Isaiah, from the womb to the tomb. And so as a result of that, we care about the sanctity of life, but we also care about that life once that person is born. And we care about fair treatment of that life, because if we are all made in his image, even non-believers are worthy of dignity and respect. And this is something that I would think that even our opponents of the woke church movement, I think that they would affirm that in light of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Lastly, the fifth component, and again, this is brief because I want to get to some of the opponents' accusations against us, is that the woke Christianity is eschatological. So we love the church. We believe in the church's perseverance. We believe that the church is God's plan A and he doesn't need a plan B. And we believe in the perseverance of the saints. And I don't see that as Calvinism. I just see that as biblical, because Jesus is the rock that he's talking about in Matthew chapter 16. And he's going to use Peter. Peter isn't the rock, Christ is. And nothing can prevail against him because he is the stone that the builders rejected. He is our foundation. And so we believe that there's an eschatological point of wokeness that again starts with justification and ends in glorification. So anyone accusing us of not understanding a biblical soteriology is talking to the wrong people. And that's one of my issues, is that they are letting outliers represent our position and then responding to the outliers as if that's our position. For instance, there are people within the Reformed community that are xenophobic, extremely judgmental, extreme, heartless, uncaring, and they feel that they are submitting to sovereignty and that or even hyper Calvinism. And I understand enough to know that those outliers within the Reformed community, that person or persons does not represent everyone who has a Reformed position. I myself would agree with most of the tenets of Reformed theology. In fact, it's not really the theology I have issue with, it's the culture. When it's imperialistic or it ignores people or wrongly makes assumptions about other people. So there's an eschatological point to where we believe in his sovereignty and that his church will prevail because Christ has prevailed, because John 16:33, because he has overcome, we will overcome in him, and we will prevail to the end. So those kind of five quickly. Again, I could go more extensively, but for the sake of time, I'll stop there. So I just want to make sure that we understand our soteriological position is that wokeness starts with being awakened to your sin and your need of salvation. And then we care about your sanctification. And I think that's where the disagreement and the misunderstandings lie. That most of our opponents are making an argument about justification and saying that we are getting away from the gospel, or we're getting away by justification by grace and through faith. And we will say, no, we're saying we engage in these issues because we are justified by grace and through faith. And in light of us being justified by grace and through faith, we want to engage in these issues. So really, there's a misunderstanding. What they're making salvific, we're saying is more dealing with sanctification. And so I want to talk about some of the opponents' accusation. There are plenty, so I don't have time to get through them all. One is the idea of social justice. And so what they'll purport or assert against us, their assertion is that we agree with all of the liberal forms and definitions of social justice. Scholarly speaking, I want to thank my man Adam Coleman for this. The term social justice did not start with the liberal left. It was primarily in Catholic circles, and it meant the common good of all people. Now, right quick before, if you're an opponent and you quickly judge, when Catholics thought of common good, it was not socialism. It was the idea of the well-being of humanity, not socialism, not Marxism. This preceded that in many ways. And so the idea of social justice just being a liberal thing, again, I would say is a wrong accusation. And then to assign everything within the liberal agenda as our viewpoint is not charitable or accurate. There's a such thing as secular conservatism. We could apply that to those that oppose us as well and say, well, yeah, I mean, do you agree with everything Trump has said and done? I recognize his position. I recognize God's sovereignty and him being our commander in chief. But I doubt even James White himself on his dividing line said he couldn't vote for Trump. And he talked about his lack of ethics. And so James White is someone who opposes the woke church. And again, I think there's a misnomer, there's misunderstanding there. And so when the Sovereign Nation Conference and Bodhi Baucham talks about social justice, I think he starts with one form in terms of the definition. He applies that to everyone within the woke church movement and then responds to that. And I'm saying that's a straw man when you say that this is the only way to define this term. Terms change. And we quickly, we know that. This is why we look at the term evangelical differently now. Why? Because we know that that term is loosely used and doesn't necessarily carry the weight and definition of what we say a biblical Christian is. And so the same thing would apply to social justice. And I get that term put together may not be a biblical term, but even evangelical and the like terms change. And so for them to say that we are pro homosexuality, that we are pro white guilt, that we are unforgiving, and to put that label on us, again, is inaccurate, it's uncharitable, it's unloving. And what happens is, now, can you find some outliers? Of course. And I can point out, if we want to play the depravity game, then that game will never end. If we want to play the depravity Olympics, that game will never end, because there'll always be outliers on both sides where they're extremely uncharitable and have said some harsh things, all in the name of what they would deem to be accurate theology. And again, I refuse to let them represent everyone who even opposes us. So it's interesting that you talk about those that are proponents of woke church, conscious Christianity, as painting everyone with a broad stroke, and then you turn around and do the very same thing to us. I mean, so that's textbook duplicity, and I think we need to be aware of that. The next claim they make about us is that it's a social gospel, that the woke church movement is all about a social gospel. Well, again, I would say that's inaccurate. We're not saying that we engage in issues of police brutality or sex trafficking, abortion. We would say, we're not saying that we engage in this because in order to gain salvation. We're saying that we care about the dignity of life in all people from the womb to the tomb because we are saved. And so the idea of it being a social gospel, again, is just inaccurate, which is why I said the first thing, that it starts with being awakened to your sin. So when we say woke, we're talking about justification by grace and through faith. And so to say something different, again, is not our position. Now, again, you can probably find someone that'll say that, but if you talk to those and you read everything, not just part of Dr. Mason's book, but if you read the whole book and not read a position you disagree with, and then let that be the whole position, then again, that's not fair and it's not accurate, nor is it loving, nor is it scholarly to take one part, because to take one part and say that that's the representation and not understand the context of the rest of the book. So it's not a social gospel. It's not a salvific thing, it's a sanctification thing. Thirdly, socialism. And so again, the socialism thing is that we want reparations, we want people to never get past the past, and we want to hold that against them, and all of these things. And I would say, again, it's not socialism. We're looking at Micah 6. We're looking at grazing in the scriptures. We're saying the scriptures show that there's a care for the poor, that there's a care for people. And before you just tell someone to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, make sure they have a pair of boots. And so that's what we're saying here, is that we should care about people. We're not saying that people don't need to work, that people don't have responsibility. We understand that if you don't work, you don't eat. And what most of us are doing is we are engaged in these communities. For instance, my church, we have something known as the Bare Necessities. It's a mentorship program at the Boys Club. There is some fatherlessness there at that Boys Club. So BEAR stands for behavior, attitude, responsibility, and entrepreneurship. And so they're seeing Christian men who look like them, who are choosing to be in their lives when many of them, their fathers chose not to. And again, we want to be a tangible display of the gospel. That's not socialism. That's not victimization. That's empowerment. They're seeing Black and brown entrepreneurs who believe and love Christ and that are choosing to engage them. We're not telling them that they can't make it. We're saying that you can, but we're acknowledging that there's injustice and that you can work through that injustice, because if Christ is in you, you can overcome. And so that's what we're doing. And so to say, again, something different, I think we need to broaden our conversations. We need to extend beyond just our own circle. I saw snippets. Actually, I watched the whole thing, a video, again, of opponents of Dr. Mason's books. and they kept asking questions. What do they want? But the problem is they were asking each other. They weren't asking people with an opposing view. Now, listen, I'm all for voices of dissent. And voices of dissent are fine. I get that we may continue to disagree. My goal is not to convert you to the woke church movement if you disagree. This is just to put an accurate narrative about what it is we actually believe. And so, again, it's rooted in biblical Christianity. And so that's where we start. We start with justification and into sanctification, and it ends in glorification. But while we are here, we want to engage, and we want to do so in a loving way. All right. And so those are some of the opposing views that they have assigned to us. And again, I think it's primarily a misunderstanding. And I'm not going to go as far as some of them have to say that they're not saved. These are still my brothers. Through Christ, we are still family. I just want to deal with the mischaracterizations. At our last Woke Church conference, Dr. Eric Mason said this himself. He said, through Christ, I am closer with a white brother who is saved than a black man who isn't. And so for those of you wrongly characterizing this man, I think it's important for you to listen, and not listen in part, not listen with a prejudicial eye and ear, but perhaps listen with an open eye and an open ear, and realize that both sides has blind spots because we see in part. And I can admit that as well. But when we are mischaracterized and you create a false narrative and respond to that as if that's our position, again, that is uncharitable, and it is not loving according to the word of Christ. Now, here's my retort on the social justice thing. They have come up with the term SJW, social justice warriors, and they assume that using a term pejoratively somehow perhaps makes them correct, and that it makes us wrong. Well, again, when you get into these subjective arguments, we can turn around and do the same thing. I could call them GOOs, Guardians of Orthodoxy. And what I would say is, when you call me a social justice warrior, whether you're using it pejoratively or not, I don't take that. I don't take that as a something to be ashamed of, because again, I'm not defining social justice as a democratic liberal agenda. I'm defining it as something we engage in light of justification by grace through faith, and living out what Jesus says about himself and how we engage the marginalized based on Matthew 25. So if I called you a guardian of orthodoxy and I use that term pejoratively, the opponents of the woke church movement and conscious Christianity will probably say, hey, I love being a guardian of orthodoxy based on 1 Timothy because he tells us to watch our doctrine. And so the same way you're coming at us with that, I'm saying there's scripture for us to say, hey, that there seems to be more scripture about confronting these things than ignoring them. We don't use sovereignty to ignore injustice. And so when we talk about injustice, we're saying the ills of this planet and things, the different way that sin plays itself out. So racial profiling is sinful. Racism is sinful. It is the sin of partiality. Treating people unfairly based on the color of their skin or their gender is unfair. Abortion is sinful. So we're saying in light, that's an injustice. So when I say injustice, I'm talking about sin. And I don't think based on the frequency of an injustice or sin that we should ignore it. So whether one man or 1,000 unarmed black men are shot, we should care if it's just one a year, because that one sinful act should be a concern of believers. Now, can we engage in everything? I get it. I know some of your argument would be, well, you need to focus on this and that. And I would say, hey, listen, we all have different areas we may focus on. Some of you would say sex trafficking. Some are going to say abortion. Others are going to say police brutality. Some are going to say gender rights and gender equality. Whatever the case may be, I'm saying that when things are done wrongly, when sin is then done, we should care. And again, we're not going to be able to cover every single thing, but just because we don't cover every issue, or because abortion isn't mentioned in a video clip, it doesn't mean that I'm not pro-life or that I don't care about it. The same way when I hear those talking about abortion, I don't hear them talk about sex trafficking. Doesn't mean that they don't care about it. So please, let's stop the pejoratives. Let's stop that, and let's try to be more charitable, diplomatic, loving, understanding, and let's ask some questions and gain clarity. Because again, hopefully we can reach a point of unity, because at the end of the day, as the universal church with the capital C, we all have the same mission: to make disciples that make disciples that glorify him. All right. Second thing is the false narrative. we could apply a false narrative to our opponents as well. We could say there are those that oppose the woke church movement who have heralded and put forth points that we would say are unbiblical as it relates to Black people. A couple quotes that I've heard are, again, Black people don't want to work, they're lazy, and they're victims. And so whenever we speak against social justice, it's because we are perpetual victims, and we're victims of victimization of the left. And they say that's what all of us represent, and they paint us with a broad stroke. And I could say, hey, that's the position of sovereign nation, and then I'm going to respond to that one or two or 100 outliers and say that that's the position of everyone who spoke at that conference. That wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be charitable, because I don't know fully Voddie's position or James White's position. I know what I heard. I know what I listened to. I can respond to that. And I would say, again, there are some things, there were assumptions made. James White tried to give it history again, and there were a lot of holes in it because it didn't include, again, how we actually start. So the false narratives have to stop. Let's talk to those that are at the foundation of this and ask questions to them. The third thing is, many of them say, and some said at the conference, is that this whole movement, the woke church movement, is built on white guilt. And again, that's another false narrative, that we just want white people to feel guilty about slavery, whether they own slaves or not. And so again, if that's your position, we can say that the Blacks you build yours on Black tokens, that you only want Blacks that are going to assimilate. You don't want Frederick Douglass, you want Booker T's. You don't want abolitionists, you want assimilationists. And because that's how you roll, you do not want any Black person that's going to disagree with you. You want Blacks that are going to go with the flow. I could say that about you, and it could be absolutely inaccurate. So be careful, again, assigning that to us, saying that we want to thrive on white guilt. We're not praying for white guilt or thriving on white guilt. Christ has nailed our shame to the cross. And so we're not building this movement out of guilt. Again, this movement starts with salvation by grace through faith. And where we clearly disagree is how sanctification works out in the life of a believer as it relates to the different forms of sin that we see happening in our society. And I'm just going to say sin and injustice. I'm going to use that synonymously, because again, the things that I'm talking about are when other people are sinned against, and how we should speak out on those things. Again, when people say, hey, you talk too much about race and not enough about abortion, those that make that claim usually say nothing about race. And so I could make the same retort against you. And again, some of you say, well, race isn't an issue. Well, that proves that it is, because how we're seeing those things differently. All right, thirdly, they say, hey, we're attacking Whitefield and Edwards and Luther. No, we're not attacking them. We would say that we're reassessing their legacy, the same way many of you who oppose us do Dr. King. And you want to go to his essays and things like that and say that we should reassess the legacy. And maybe you go in far as say we shouldn't celebrate him. Well, we shouldn't celebrate him. We should not celebrate anti-Semites. We shouldn't celebrate these guys. Again, Martin Luther said this in his writing titled "On the Jews and Their Lies." First, to set fire to their synagogues or school, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. This is Martin Luther, the great reformer. Do you agree with that? Those of you who held his theology, do you held that ethic? I think I want to be charitable enough to say that he had some great theological points, but his ethics did not always match his theology. And if our ethics don't match our theology, wouldn't we say that that's probably some issues with our theology? Because if ethics don't matter, wouldn't we say that's functional antinomianism, that theology and ethics must coincide? Wouldn't we say that? I hope so. I hope we would agree with that. And so when I point that out, I'm just saying, hey, maybe that's not something we want to applaud. And maybe that's something we should look at. Again, all of our earthly heroes are imperfect. I get it, every last one of them, except Jesus. But when we point that out, it doesn't mean that we're attacking them. We're just reassessing their legacy, because when we sit in these classes, racists and slave owners are heralded as heroes. And I'm saying that, again, if we're going to ignore ethics, then we're going to have a theological problem and a cultural problem, and most likely even a soteriological problem, because James and John would say that there is an ethic. There should be something that shows our salvation. All right, next they say, Martin, I'm just retorting some of these things. They say race is no longer an issue. Okay, according to who? Race is no longer an issue according to who? My point is that's a subjective viewpoint. It's a subjective viewpoint that we would have to admit that that's subjective. Then the second question to when you say race is no longer an issue, compared to what? So if you're saying compared to the transatlantic slave trade, or compared to the 1800s, or even compared to the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Well, let me back up. A lot of Black and brown people don't consider the Emancipation Proclamation freedom. For those of you that are familiar with Juneteenth, the act of slavery was still taking place for 2 years before people in Galveston, Texas found out that they were free. Next, and this is theological, if you're a biblical Christian, you would have to agree that you can't legislate the heart. So do you think because Abraham Lincoln signed a sheet of paper, or that even Lyndon Johnson signed some paper, that changed the hearts of white supremacists? That a sheet of paper changed their hearts? Because that tends to be the argument that we hear. Well, they have certain rights now, or laws were changed. So laws does not change the hearts of people, right? And we know that you're not saved by the law, soteriologically, but it seems that we, in terms of our soteriology, it seems that we ignore that as it relates to our anthropology. That if we can't legislate the heart, what makes you think that laws change people who were in power? And so you had sharecropping, you had manumission, and then to say that 1968, because that again another law was signed, to think that 1968 changed the hearts of people, which means that we don't even have 70 years of actual freedom. For me, it's just a misnomer. Again, I know some of you may disagree, but again, as some of you say, facts don't care about your feelings. This is a fact. These laws, when they were done, this is a fact. I'm not talking about feelings. I'm talking about facts. And so it's a fact that authentic freedom wasn't until the late 60s. And you think everything changed within the last 70 years? So when one says race is not an issue, I think they're doing a couple things. One, they are victims, or they're applying what I call experiential Gnosticism. What they're saying is, my experience is, and they'll get Black people to say the same thing. Well, I haven't experienced racism, and I believe you. Maybe you haven't, but that's not my experience, and that's not many of the experience of people I talk to. So don't make your experience universal to come to the conclusion that it's not an issue because it's not an issue for you. Just because it's not an issue for you based on your experience isn't universal. Now, neither is mine. But again, that would also prove that it is an issue because there are so many different views, and it's something that we should engage. Now, even if you believe race is a social construct, you would have to admit it's a social construct we can't ignore. And we need to apply the gospel to it. All right. Last, or two more. Again, so what I'm saying is, I think the biggest issue is what they're claiming to be our view of justification. We're claiming to be erroneous view of sanctification. So we're coming from two different points of the spectrum. We're not dealing with this from a salvific standpoint. We're dealing with this from a sanctification standpoint. All right. And lastly, let's just talk very briefly about sovereignty. If we're affirming sovereignty, God's sovereignty, then those that did the Sovereign Nation Conference would also, to some degree, have to admit that God sovereignly know, and I would say affirms, the woke church movement as well, because he's sovereign. And he knows that there's a section of people that are completely ignored by our current apologetic efforts. And there are some churches who really don't think it's an issue, so they'll never broach the topic. So he sovereignly raises up those who are justified by grace through faith to engage these issues. And while you may have your particular context that you engage, we're saying that we don't want to limit the context to one, but we don't want to ignore any, because the gospel should permeate every aspect of our being. and the gospel should engage every subject with the truth of God, his gospel, and his word. And that's what's the motivation. It's not just wokeness as a philosophy, but being awakened to your sin and then caring about others as a tangible display of the gospel. And so that's our hope. And so, I just wanted to bring that clarity. I see tons of comments. I'll kind of go back through this later. My goal is not to respond live on comments, but to kind of address a few things and kind of respond that way. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll read through your comments. I'll be able to respond to some, not all. I pray that you can, if you feel led, share this. Hopefully this can be helpful. And again, my goal is unity. My goal is unity. I know some may disagree with that, but the goal is unity because I think we're misunderstanding each other when we are the capital C church and we have one mission, and that's his glory. All right. Love y'all. Grace and peace.